The alien queen didn't die, she planned this for 5,000 years. The first thing Commander Yael Dresch noticed was that the queen wasn't breathing. The second thing she noticed was that the queen was smiling. That distinction mattered more than any briefing she'd received in her 11 years with the Galactic Coalition Expeditionary Force. Dead things didn't smile. Not like that. Not with the quiet, settled expression of someone who had just finished a very long, very satisfying meal. The war room aboard the ISV Resolute had gone completely silent. 47 officers, analysts, and tactical advisors stood around the holographic display table and stared at the feed coming in from the surface of Visara Prime. The Kareth Queen, the creature they had spent 6 years hunting, the intelligence behind 43 coordinated assaults on human colonies, the architect of the Deimos Accord's collapse, lay sprawled across the floor of her command chamber with what appeared to be a self-inflicted wound through her primary cortex node. "Confirm biometrics," Dresch said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Lieutenant Karofan worked her console without looking up. Neural pulse, absent. Carapace thermal signature, dropping. Secondary hearts, she has 3, all inactive. Van paused. "She's dead, Commander." The room exhaled. Someone in the back made a sound that might have been a sob. Admiral Vasek Oren, a man who had personally lost his homeworld colony to the Kareth in the opening months of the war, placed both hands flat on the display table and closed his eyes. Dresch didn't celebrate. She kept staring at the feed. "Pull back the camera," she said. "Show me the room." Van complied. The holographic image widened. The Queen's chamber was enormous, vaulted ceilings of bioluminescent resin, walls lined with what Kareth xenobiologists had classified as memory coral, living organic data storage that the species used instead of digital architecture. The room was immaculate. Orderly. Every surface arranged with a precision that felt intentional. Too intentional. "She didn't fight," Dresch said quietly. Vasek opened his eyes. "What?" "Look at the chamber. Our breach team hit that room 6 minutes ago. There are no defensive spore clusters, no guard drones, no secondary barricades. She had 3 fully functional personal guard units stationed on the level above. They didn't move. She didn't call them." Dresch walked around the display table slowly, studying the feed from every angle. "She was alone, unarmed, and she was waiting. She knew we were coming," Vasek said. "She chose to die rather than be captured. It's not unheard of in Kareth command culture." "She chose to die 6 minutes before we breached," Dresch said. "Van, give me the timeline. Time of death versus time of breach." Van pulled the data. Her hands slowed. "Estimated time of death is 8 minutes, 40 seconds before the breach team entered the chamber." The room went quiet again. A different kind of quiet this time. 8 minutes and 40 seconds. Not a queen caught in a desperate moment. Not a leader executing a final act of defiance. 8 minutes and 40 seconds was a decision made calmly, deliberately, with full knowledge of exactly when the humans would arrive. It was choreography. "She timed it," Dresch said. No one argued with her. She turned to the memory coral along the walls. The bioluminescent patterns running through it were still active, slow rhythmic pulses of amber and deep violet that the Kareth used as a kind of long-term archival medium. Coalition xenobiologists had cracked the basic encoding structure 18 months ago. It was dense, layered, and extraordinarily slow to read. Each structure could hold the equivalent of decades of compressed behavioral data. "I want every xenolinguist we have on those walls," Dresch said. "Full extraction. I don't care if it takes a month." "Commander," said Vasek, and his voice carried the weight of a man who very much wanted to celebrate and very much didn't want to be told he shouldn't. "The war is over. The Queen is dead. Every Kareth command structure we've been tracking is linked to her primary cortex. With her gone, the network fragments. That's the intelligence consensus." "I know what the consensus says." Dresch finally looked away from the feed. She looked at Vasek directly, and she chose her next words with the deliberate care of someone who had spent a career learning that the worst disasters in human history had all begun with an unanswered question. "I also know that a species capable of coordinating 43 simultaneous assaults across 11 star systems for 6 years, without a single significant intelligence leak, does not die sloppy." Vasek studied her for a long moment. "What are you saying?" Dresch looked back at the smiling Queen. "I'm saying she didn't lose," she said. "I'm saying she finished." The extraction team spent 4 days inside the Queen's chamber before the first xenolinguist, a woman named Dr. Priya Sohal, who had dedicated 9 years of her academic career to cracking Kareth memory coral encoding, emerged from the chamber looking like she'd aged a decade. She found Dresh in the ship's observation bay, staring at the curve of Visara Prime below. "You need to come see this," Sohal said. "How much did you read?" "Enough." Sohal's voice was careful. Measured. "The archive in that room it's not a record of this war, Commander. It's not tactical logs or command communications. It's something else entirely." She hesitated. "The oldest layer in those walls dates back, and we've run this 3 times because the number didn't seem possible, approximately 5,000 years. Dresh turned from the window. 5,000 years, she repeated. "Give or take a century. The encoding degradation is consistent with that age range." Sohal pulled up a data tablet. "The Kareth don't have a word that directly translates to plan in the way we use it. The closest equivalent in their language is a concept that means something like cultivated patience. The deliberate shaping of conditions across generations, with the expectation that the harvest comes long after the planter is gone." She held Dresh's gaze. "That chamber isn't her command post. It's the final page of a document that began before humans had written language." The observation bay felt very small suddenly. "What's in the document?" Dresh asked. Sohal looked down at her tablet. She looked like a woman who had gone looking for answers and found, instead, a much larger question. "Us," she said simply. "The whole document is about us. About humanity. About what we would do, how we would fight, how we would think when we finally cornered her." She set the tablet down on the nearest surface, as if she didn't want to hold it anymore. "The Queen didn't die because she lost, Commander. She died because it was time. Because we were exactly where she needed us to be." Outside, Visara Prime turned slowly in its orbit. Beautiful and brown and very, very old. Dresh picked up the tablet. She started reading. The tablet felt heavier than it should have. Dresh knew that was psychological. 12 years in the GCEF had given her enough combat psychology training to recognize when her own nervous system was catastrophizing. The tablet weighed exactly what it always weighed. The data inside it had no physical mass. And yet, she read standing up, in the observation bay, with Visara Prime scrolling slowly behind her and Dr. Sohal sitting in the far corner with the expression of someone waiting at a hospital. The xenolinguists had been working in relay teams, sleeping in 4-hour rotations, running the memory coral extractions through 3 simultaneous translation matrices to cross-check for encoding errors. What Dresh held was not a full translation. That would take months, possibly years. What she held was a summary. A structured overview of the document's architecture, organized by chronological layer. The oldest material, approximately 5,000 years deep, from a time when the Kareth were still a pre-spaceflight species confined to their home system, was abstract, philosophical. It used a framework of interlocking concepts that had no clean human equivalent, but which the xenolinguists had rendered as something approximating. The study of a species that does not yet exist in a form worth studying. Dresh read that line 3 times. The Kareth, 5,000 years ago, had been watching. Not humans specifically. Not yet. The document's earliest layers described something the xenolinguists had flagged with a cautionary note. A systematic Kareth practice of cataloging emerging civilizations across a wide band of the galaxy, assessing their developmental trajectories, and selecting candidates for what the document called, in the closest available translation, deep engagement. Not war. Not trade. Not diplomacy. Deep engagement. "Sohal," Dresh said without looking up. "What does that term mean in full context?" "Deep engagement." Sohal had clearly been expecting the question. "It's a multi-layered concept. The literal root is agricultural. It comes from a word meaning to plant something in soil that won't be ready to receive the seed for a long time. But in strategic context, the xenolinguists are interpreting it as..." She paused, choosing her words. "The deliberate initiation of a relationship designed to produce a specific outcome in a target civilization. Not through force. Through shaping." Dresh lowered the tablet. "They were shaping us." The document suggests that humanity was identified as a candidate civilization approximately 4,200 years ago. That's when the specific human-focused layers begin. Sohal stood up. "That's pre-Roman Empire, Commander. That's before we had iron tools in most of the world." Dresh walked to the observation window. The planet below was quiet, ancient, unbothered. She thought about the first Kareth contact. 83 years ago, the encounter at Kepler Station as it had been named in the history books. A Kareth probe, apparently malfunctioning, recovered by a coalition salvage team. The probe had contained what xenobiologists at the time called a biological greeting package, genetic material, biochemical markers, a kind of interstellar calling card. The scientific consensus had been that it was accidental. A lost probe from a civilization that didn't yet know humanity existed. Pull up the Kepler station encounter file, Dresch said. Fun, who had followed them from the war room and was standing quietly near the doorway, was already working her wrist pad. The encounter file materialized on the observation bay's secondary display. Dresch crossed to it. She read the original salvage report. The probe's trajectory had been reconstructed at the time and found to originate from deep space. No clear point of origin. The biological package had been treated as a curiosity and archived. Low priority. The consensus that it was accidental had gone unchallenged for 83 years. Until now. The trajectory, Dresch said. Was it ever rerun with updated data? Fun was quiet for a moment. Then, no, Commander. The original calculation was accepted and the file closed. Run it now. Use everything we have on Kareth spatial navigation, their drive signatures, their preferred transit corridors, all of it. Fun ran it. It took 11 minutes. When the result came back, no one spoke for a long time. The probe had originated from a point within Kareth-controlled space. Not deep space. Not some anonymous sector of the galaxy. It had been launched from a system that the Coalition had only identified as Kareth held in the last 12 years of the war. The probe had been sent directly to humanity. 83 years ago. At a time when the Kareth officially didn't know humans existed. They introduced themselves, Dresch said quietly. On their timeline. When they were ready. She went back to the tablet summary. She found the section the xenolinguists had flagged as the most significant. It covered a period approximately 300 years ago, deep within the document's middle layers. A chapter of the record dedicated entirely to what the Kareth called threshold assessment. The concept was detailed. The Kareth had developed, over centuries, a predictive framework for evaluating when a target civilization crossed what they called a critical symmetry point, the moment at which a species had developed precisely the right combination of technological capability, psychological cohesion, and strategic aggression to be genuinely useful. Useful for what, the document didn't specify in this section. But the threshold assessment for humanity had been conducted and recorded 270 years before the Kepler station encounter. 270 years ago, the Kareth had evaluated humanity and determined, they are ready. And then they had waited. They didn't start a war with us, Dresch said. She was speaking slowly, assembling it in real time. They waited until we were developed enough to fight one. Then they introduced themselves. Then they started the conflict. On their terms, Sohal said. At their chosen moment. And ended it on their terms. Dresch set the tablet down. She didn't die because we cornered her. She died because the war was supposed to end. Right now. Right here. She turned back to the planet. Which means the question isn't whether this was planned. She pressed her palm flat against the cold observation glass. The question is what comes next. Because in every document there is a final chapter. And the Queen, who had smiled in her own death with the patience of 5,000 years behind her, had not written all of this without an ending in mind. Dresch picked the tablet back up. She turned to the last translated section. It was titled, in the xenolinguist's best available rendering of the concept, simply, the inheritance. The word inheritance was wrong. Dresch knew it as soon as she read further. The xenolinguists had flagged the translation themselves with a lengthy annotation. The Kareth concept, rendered phonetically as Velsora, carried connotations that no single human word could hold cleanly. It was partly inheritance, yes, but also debt. Also responsibility. Also something closer to the thing a parent leaves in a child who doesn't yet know what they've been given. All of those meanings woven together describing something left behind by the Queen. For humanity. Dresch read the section twice, then called a full command briefing. Not the inner circle, everyone. Every department head aboard the Resolute, connected via secure relay to the 12 coalition flagships maintaining orbital position above Visara Prime. 104 officers across 13 ships in real time. She didn't soften it. The document in the Queen's chamber is not a historical record, she began. It is an instruction set. Over 5,000 years across multiple generations of Kareth leadership, a sequential program was designed, maintained, and executed. Its stated purpose, translated as accurately as our best xenolinguists can manage, is to prepare humanity for contact with something the Kareth call the Vel Kareth. She let that sit. Admiral Vasek, attending via relay from his flagship, spoke first. The Vel Kareth. Not the Kareth. Correct. The distinction appears to be significant. The Kareth, the species we fought, refer to themselves in the document using their standard species designation. The Velcareth are referenced differently. Older. Separate. The translation team's best interpretation is that the Velcareth are to the Careth what the Careth are to us. A civilization so far ahead in development that the gap is almost categorical. The silence across 13 ships was absolute. The war, Dresch continued, was not a war. It was a training program. She brought up the relevant document section on the shared display. The Xenolinguists had organized the Velsora, the inheritance, into 3 distinct components, each embedded in the memory coral at different depths, suggesting they had been written at different periods across the 5,000-year span. The first component was catalogued as capability assessment data. The Careth had compiled an exhaustive analysis of human military evolution across the 6 years of the conflict. Every engagement, every tactical innovation, every doctrinal shift the coalition had made in response to Careth pressure. The document described this not as intelligence gathered against an enemy, but as a developmental profile compiled on a student. They were watching how we learned, said Captain Iron Voss, commanding the ISV Dawnfall. Her voice was carefully controlled. Not to exploit our patterns. To record them. For the Velcareth, Dresch confirmed. The second component is what the translation team is calling a contact protocol. A set of encoded behavioral guidelines, not for us to follow but guidelines that the document suggests the Velcareth will use when they approach us. Rules of engagement for a first contact. She paused. The Careth appear to have been functioning as intermediaries, preparing us so that when the Velcareth make contact, we won't be destroyed by the encounter. Vasik's voice was very quiet. And the third component? Dresch looked at the section. The Xenolinguists had spent the most time on this one. It was also the most recent layer, written, based on encoding degradation analysis, within the last 200 years. Possibly within the last century. It was, in the translation team's words, a message. Not encoded behavioral data. Not strategic framework. A message. Written in a form of Careth that the Xenolinguists described as unusually direct, stripped of the layered conceptual density that characterized the rest of the document. As though the author had deliberately chosen clarity over nuance. As though the author had written it knowing it would be read by humans. Dresch read it aloud. You fought well. Better than the third assessment projected. The anger in your species is genuine, this is good. Anger without fear becomes courage. Courage without wisdom becomes waste. You have the first two. The third is what the war was for. We are sorry for the deaths. We are not sorry for the war. There is no other way to grow a species into what it needs to become. We tried softer methods with others. They did not survive what came after. The Velcareth are not hostile. They are simply large. A wave is not cruel. But without preparation, it drowns everything it touches. You are prepared now. When they come, and they will come, within 2 generations of this reading, stand as you stood in the last 6 years. Not with aggression. With the dignity of a species that has earned its place. The inheritance we leave you is not a weapon. It is a record of what you are, given to those who come next so they will know you are worth speaking to. We chose you because you were worth choosing. The Queen is gone. The program is complete. What you do with what you've learned is yours. The briefing channel was silent for a long time. Dresch set the tablet down on the table in front of her. Outside the Resolute's viewports, Visara Prime caught the light of its sun, warm amber across brown terrain, a world older than human civilization by an order of magnitude. Vasik's voice when it came was rough. They killed millions of our people. Yes, Dresch said. To train us. Yes. And we're supposed to, what? Accept that? Be grateful? Dresch considered the question for a long time. She thought about the colonies that had burned. The ships that had been lost. The 11 years she had spent building her career around the Careth as an enemy, as a problem to be solved, as a darkness to be driven back. No, she said finally. I don't think the document asks us to be grateful. I think it asks us to decide. She picked the tablet back up. We have, by their estimate, 2 generations before the Velcareth arrive. That's 40 to 80 years. And the Careth left us a 5,000-year record of their methodology, a complete playbook for how they prepared us. She looked at the relay screens. 104 officers watching her. Which means we have a choice. We can spend those 40 years in grief and rage trying to make sense of what was done to us. Or we can spend them the way the Careth spent theirs, deliberately. Preparing. She set the tablet down again gently this time. The Queen didn't leave us a trap. She left us a gift. A terrible, costly, genuine gift. She thought of the smiling face on the feed. She knew we'd figure it out, Dresh thought. She planned on it. The question, Dresh said, is what kind of species we want to be when the wave arrives. The grief hit 3 days later. Not on the ships. The ships maintained their professional composure, their operational rhythms, the thousand small disciplined habits that kept military personnel functional in the aftermath of world-altering information. The grief hit on Earth. On the colonies. In the living rooms and public squares and hospital waiting rooms of 200 billion human beings who had just learned that the war they had survived, the war that had taken fathers and daughters and childhood friends and entire city populations from 17 different worlds, had been designed. Dresh was aboard the Resolute when the first transmission came in from Earth Command. Admiral General Sione Fatu, the highest-ranking military officer in the coalition, appeared on the command display looking like a man standing in rubble. The document's existence is public, Fatu said. We couldn't contain it, the extraction teams talked. Social systems are processing. He rubbed his face. It's not good, Yael. No, she agreed. It wouldn't be. The bereavement councils are calling it the greatest atrocity in human history. There's a faction in the parliament arguing we should destroy the document entirely, claim it's Kareth disinformation. Psychological warfare designed to destabilize us even after the Queen's death. Dresh had expected that argument. It was the easiest one to make. It was also the one she was most afraid of. Is Vasek leading that faction? She asked. Pause. He's not leading it. She closed her eyes briefly. We can't destroy it. I know. If we destroy it and the Velkareth arrive in 40 years and we're not ready. I know, Yael. Fatu's voice was tired. The tiredness of someone carrying weight they hadn't agreed to carry. But you need to understand what you're asking people to accept. You're asking families who lost children to accept that those children died as part of a lesson plan. You're asking worlds that were bombed flat to accept that the bombing was pedagogical. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not asking anyone to accept it as acceptable, she said carefully. I'm asking them to understand it as real. Those aren't the same thing. The distinction won't comfort many people. No, it won't. She moved to her viewport. The planet was still there. Still turning. But comfort and survival aren't always compatible. The call ended. Dresh remained at the viewport for a long time. She thought about what she knew of the Karetha's own history, pieced together from 40 years of pre-war xenoarchaeology and 6 years of wartime intelligence. The Kareth were not a cruel species in the biological sense. Their society had no concept of casual violence. Their art, and there was art, extraordinary art recovered from early contact sites, was dominated by themes of growth and duration. Long cycles. Patient transformation. They had not enjoyed the war. Dresh was increasingly certain of that. She had read enough of the document now to recognize something she hadn't expected. The Kareth had mourned their own losses. There were passages, in the middle layers 2 centuries old, that the xenolinguists had flagged as unusual in tone. Quieter than the surrounding material. More personal. They appeared to be individual entries, written by different hands over generations. Kareth commanders and analysts and, in several cases, ordinary soldiers who had participated in the Velsora program. They all expressed some version of the same thing. We do not want to be doing this. We do it because we were done to. Because the Velkareth prepared us the same way. Because there is no other path that ends with them surviving contact. The Kareth had been prepared by the Velkareth. Exactly as they were now preparing humanity. Was a chain. An ancient, terrible, carefully maintained chain of civilizations. Each one carrying the next generation through fire because fire was the only school that produced graduates capable of surviving what came after. Dresh pulled up the translation of the oldest layer again. The material from 5,000 years ago, when the Kareth had first begun their systematic assessment of the galaxy's emerging civilizations. She read the opening passage which the xenolinguists had rendered as, "We were given this work by those who came before us. We did not ask for it. We did not want it. We have done it because we were given no other choice by what exists beyond the edge of what we knew. If you are reading this, if you are the ones we have been shaping, then the work is done. The choice is now yours. You may curse us and we would understand. But we hope, in time, you will do what we could not manage in our own hearts. Forgive us and carry the chain forward." Dresh read it 3 times. Then she wrote a message to Admiral General Fatu. The document cannot be destroyed. But it doesn't need to be made fully public yet either. Give me 6 months. I want to assemble a team, historians, grief counselors, xenobiologists, military ethicists. Not to manage the information. To build a framework for processing it. The Kareth left us their entire methodology. Let's use it. Let's be deliberate about how we introduce this to our own civilization. She sent it. Then she added a second message, shorter. And I want to find the Vel-Kareth before they find us. Because the document, in its final component, had included something the briefing had not covered. Something Dresh had read alone late at night in her quarters. A set of coordinates. Not to the Vel-Kareth home system. Not to some staging ground or embassy station. The coordinates pointed to a location in deep space, far past the edge of current coalition survey range, where, according to the document, the Vel-Kareth had left something of their own. A message. For whoever was ready to receive it. The Queen in her final days had not only completed the training program. She had pointed humanity at the door. Whether they were brave enough, or wise enough, to open it was, as she had said, theirs to decide. The ship was called the Velmara. Dresh named it herself, 6 months after the war's end, standing in the Titan shipyards with a naming writ in her hand and a crew of 312 people who had all volunteered, knowing exactly where they were going and exactly how far outside any existing map they would travel. Velmara. The xenolinguists had given her options. She had chosen the one that translated most closely as the thing that grows in the direction of the sun, even when the sun is not yet visible. It seemed appropriate. The political situation on Earth had stabilized, barely and unevenly, and with the kind of stability that looks like calm water over a riptide. The bereavement councils had not dissolved. The faction arguing for suppression of the document had not gone away. 2 of the 17 worlds that had suffered surface bombardment during the war had formally petitioned the coalition parliament to classify the Velsora document as a war crime artifact and seal it permanently. Parliament had voted to defer the petition for 10 years, pending further study. Dresh had taken that as the best outcome she was likely to get and moved on. The crew of the Velmara was the most carefully assembled team in the history of human deep space exploration. Not the most decorated, Dresh had deliberately avoided prioritizing military honors. She had selected for a different profile, people who were curious without being reckless. People who could hold 2 contradictory truths simultaneously without needing to collapse them into one. People who had lost something in the war and had processed that loss into something other than rage. She had also selected, over significant political resistance, for Kareth. Not prisoners. Not captives. Volunteers, members of the Kareth civilian research cast who had presented themselves to the coalition 3 months after the Queen's death, carrying their own documentation. A briefing packet, written in formats compatible with human translation systems, that they had clearly prepared well in advance of approaching coalition authorities. The packet was titled, in Kareth Velsora, Supplementary Materials. The Queen had planned for them too. Their names, rendered phonetically for human use, were Aresh, Korveth, Senetal, and the one Dresh had come to think of as simply the Archivist, whose actual designation was a sound cluster that human vocal anatomy couldn't produce. The Archivist was old. Ancient, by Kareth standards, the equivalent, in rough biological terms, of a 200-year-old human. Dresh was not sure what kept the Archivist functional, but she had stopped asking after the third politely deflected answer and decided some questions could wait. The Archivist knew the coordinates. Had known them for decades. Had, it transpired, been one of the document's final authors. The being who had written the message Dresh had read alone in her quarters in those first raw weeks after the discovery. We do not want to be doing this. We do it because we were done to. Dresh had recognized the phrasing when she finally met the Archivist face to face. You wrote it, she had said. The Archivist Translation Unit, a sophisticated piece of Kareth technology that converted their subsonic communication into audible human-range speech, rendered their response with a flat effect that Dresh had learned to look past. The emotional content was in the choice of words. I wrote the apology, the Archivist said. The program I did not write. I inherited it as you will inherit what comes next. Do you know what the Vel-Kareth's message says? No. The coordinates were given to us the same way we give them to you. Still. To be opened only in transit when you are already committed. Pause. This is deliberate. It is not cruelty. It is the prevention of political paralysis. If you know what the message contains before you leave, your governments will debate it for decades. The Vel-Kareth understand how governing bodies work. Dresh had almost laughed. The Vel-Kareth understand how governing bodies work. 5,000 years of watching civilizations develop, and they had identified, correctly, that the single greatest enemy of necessary action was committee deliberation. She had made the Archivist her chief advisor. The Velmara departed Titan on a Tuesday which felt anticlimactic. There was a ceremony, Smaller than Dresch had wanted, larger than she'd expected, broadcast across the coalition network to an audience that was still, 6 months on, trying to decide how it felt about all of this. She gave a short speech. She did not talk about destiny. She did not use the word chosen. She talked about what she knew, that the universe was larger than they had understood, that it had been watching them longer than they had been watching it, and that 312 people were going to go find out what it wanted to say. The Velmara engaged its primary drive and slid out of the ecliptic. The coordinates were sealed in a quantum-locked file that would only open once they crossed the boundary the document had specified, a particular region of deep space, far past the Kareth outer systems, past the survey range of any coalition probe. They crossed it on day 47. The file opened. Dresch read the coordinates alone in her command chair, on the bridge, with the crew at their stations and the archivist standing quietly in the corner, exactly as they had been during every significant moment since the expedition launched. Then she looked up at her navigator. "Set course," she said. "For where, Commander?" She read out the coordinates. The navigator entered them, and the system returned a calculated arrival time. Dresch looked at it for a moment. Then she said, 14 months. Well. She leaned back in her chair. Plenty of time to be ready. Outside the viewports, the stars were very old and very patient and absolutely indifferent, the way only things that have been waiting for a very long time can manage to be. On the 93rd day of transit, the Velmara picked up a signal. It was not supposed to be there. The coordinates pointed to a region that coalition survey data, sparse as it was this far out, classified as a stellar void. Low star density, no known habitable systems, no catalogued anomalies. The kind of region deep space cartographers marked with the navigational equivalent of "here there is nothing of interest" and moved on. The signal was not nothing. It was structured. Repeating. Broadcasting on a frequency range that human instruments could detect but that no human instrument had been designed to decode. A frequency that fell between the standard ranges, in a gap that had been classified as background noise for a century of radio astronomy. Dr. Sohal, who had joined the expedition as lead xenolinguist, was on the bridge within 4 minutes of the signal's detection. She listened to the first automated analysis with the careful expression of someone who has learned not to get excited until they have a reason. Then she turned to Dresch. "It's Kareth," she said. "Old Kareth. Older than anything in the document archive." She pulled the waveform up on the bridge display. "But it's not addressed to the Kareth." "Who's it addressed to?" Sohal highlighted a specific encoding cluster in the signal's repeating header. "This designation. The xenolinguists are working on it now, but the root concept appears to be, and this is very rough, the ones who come after the ones who come after us. A skip generation address. Not written for the Kareth. Written for whoever the Kareth would eventually prepare. Written for humanity." "How old is it?" Dresch asked. Sohal checked with the analysis team. Came back with an answer that she delivered with the steady voice of someone who had already had her worldview restructured several times in the past 6 months and had developed a professional relationship with the impossible. Estimated broadcast origin. Approximately 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years. 7,000 years before the Kareth began their 5,000-year program. Someone had known 12 millennia ago that humanity would eventually arrive at this point in this region and need to hear something. The archivist, standing in their customary position near the bridge's port bulkhead, made a sound that the translation unit rendered as, "Ah." Just that. The sound of something confirmed. "You knew this was here," Dresch said. "I knew something was here," the archivist said. The Velsora document references a deep anchor, a term we understood as metaphorical. A conceptual foundation. We did not know it was literal. That it was broadcast. A pause long by Kareth standards. The Vel-Kareth are more thorough than even we understood. It took 11 days to decode enough of the signal to extract its core content. 11 days of relay team work, cross-referencing the signal's encoding structure against the deep archive Kareth linguistic data the archivist carried in their own biological memory, building translation bridges between 3 languages, Vel-Kareth, Ancient Kareth, and Human, that had never been in direct contact. Dresch spent most of those 11 days in the ship's small research library, reading everything the Velmara's archives contained on the history of human civilization. Not the military history. Not the political history. The quiet history, the long, slow story of how humans had moved from fire-making to city-building to spaceflight across a span of time that, measured against 12,000 years of pre-planned cosmic correspondence, felt both very short and very impressive. She was trying to understand what the Vel-Kareth had seen 42 centuries ago, that had made them decide humanity was worth watching. She thought she might have found part of the answer in a passage from an old Earth anthropologist, a field researcher who had spent decades studying early human social networks, writing about the unusual property that distinguished Homo sapiens from most social species, the ability to cooperate with strangers at scale, to extend trust tentatively to individuals the cooperating party had never met and would never meet, based purely on shared abstract frameworks, language, story, belief, law. The capacity to act together without being together, the anthropologist had written. This is either the most dangerous thing in the universe or the most necessary. Possibly both. Dresch folded the page over. On the 11th day, Sohal came to find her. The signal's core content is decoded, she said. They gathered on the bridge. All senior staff. The archivist. The 4 Kareth advisors, who had been characteristically quiet throughout the 11 days, as if they too were waiting with a particular kind of held breath. Sohal put the decoded message on the main display. It was short. Shorter than Dresch had expected, given the scale of the broadcast infrastructure that must have been required to sustain a 12,000-year repeating signal. It was 9 sentences. She read them slowly. This is a record of what we were, left for what comes after us. We do not know your name. We know your shape, we have seen it in the patterns that precede all things like you. You are the kind of being that fights and suffers and does not stop. This is not a flaw. This is the qualification. We built what you will find at the coordinates below because we ran out of time to finish it ourselves. It is not a weapon. It is not a gift. It is a responsibility. We are gone. What we built remains. It has been waiting. You are ready. Go. Below the 9 sentences were new coordinates. Different from the ones that had brought them here. Deeper. Dresch stared at them for a long time. Then she looked at the archivist. Did the Vel-Kareth know about this? She asked. The Vel-Kareth, the archivist said, were also prepared by someone. As we were prepared by them. As you were prepared by us. Pause. The chain, Commander, is longer than any of us knew. Dresch looked at the coordinates. 14 months to the previous destination. She didn't ask the navigator how far the new ones were. Not yet. She looked around the bridge at her crew. At 312 people who had left behind everything familiar to go find a door, and had instead found a corridor. Are we afraid? She asked the room. Not rhetorically. She wanted to know. The answers came back in expressions more than words. In the set of shoulders and the direction of gazes and the small, careful nods that meant yes and we're going anyway. That, she thought, was the answer the Vel-Kareth had been looking for. That had always been the answer. Set course, she said. They found it at the edge of everything. Not metaphorically. Not poetically. Literally, the new coordinates placed them at the outermost boundary of the region the Vel-Kareth had apparently mapped before whatever had ended them, beyond which the Velmara's instruments recorded a transition in the fundamental density of dark matter distribution that the ship's physicist described, with unusual academic restraint, as unprecedented in current cosmological modeling. It was a structure. The human brain, Dresch had always believed, was not well designed for encountering things that had no precedent. It searched for analogies. It reached for the nearest familiar shape and tried to map it onto the unfamiliar one. Standing at the Velmara's forward viewports, watching the structure resolve from distance into detail, she felt her brain attempting this process and failing. The closest analogy was a station. But a station implied human scale, corridors and docking ports and pressurized compartments designed for bodies like hers. This was a station the way a mountain was a stone. Structurally related. Categorically different. It extended across a volume of space that her instruments calculated in units that required the navigator to create a new display scale, because the standard ones weren't large enough. It was dark. Dormant. Not dead. The Velmara's passive sensors picked up energy signatures consistent with operational systems in standby mode. Waiting as the message had said. Patient in the way that only purpose-built things can be patient. Not hoping, simply ready. 12,000 years. Sohal said quietly, standing beside Dresch at the viewport. It's been sitting here for 12,000 years, waiting for someone to arrive. Longer than that, maybe, Dresch said. We don't know when they built it. We know when they last broadcast. The archivist joined them. In 6 months of working alongside the ancient Kareth, Dresch had learned to read their nonverbal communication, the subtle shifts in carapace orientation, the changes in the infrared signature their bodies emitted, the micro-adjustments in stance that their translation unit didn't capture. What she read now was something she had never seen in the archivist before. She was fairly certain it was awe. My people never knew, the archivist said quietly. We were told of the Velmara, the inheritance, but we were not told of this. Pause. Whatever the Velkareth were preparing us to face, they were preparing themselves to face something larger still. The chain keeps going, Dresh said. Yes. She thought about the 9-sentence message. It is not a weapon. It is not a gift. It is a responsibility. She thought about what kind of responsibility required a structure this size, built at the edge of the known, maintained in standby for 12 millennia. She thought about the Kareth 4,000 years ago, making a decision to begin the long work of shaping humanity. She thought about the Queen in the last years of her life, writing the final layers of the document. She thought about the smile on the dead Queen's face, not the smile of someone who had won, or even of someone who had done what was necessary. The smile of someone who had kept a promise. The Queen kept faith with a program she didn't start and wouldn't live to see completed, Dresh said aloud. Yes, the archivist said. 5,000 years of Kareth leadership, each generation handing this to the next. None of them ever meeting us. None of them knowing if it would work. Just continuing. Because the ones before them had started it, and the ones before them had been given no choice, and somewhere at the beginning of that chain there were beings we don't have names for who looked at the universe and decided that the only moral response to what they found was to make sure someone else could face it. She was quiet for a moment. That's not villainy, she said. That's the most sustained act of hope I've ever encountered. Basara Prime had felt like the end of a war. This felt like the beginning of something that she didn't have language for yet. They sent a probe first. Then a small scout team. Then, when the structure systems responded, not aggressively, not with lockout protocols or weaponized countermeasures, but with a slow, graceful awakening, lights coming on sequentially through a superstructure the size of a moon, a process that took 11 hours and that the Velmara's crew watched in complete silence. Dresh suited up and went herself. The interior was built for a physiology that was not human and not Kareth, but that had clearly been designed with eventual human-scale use in mind. Corridors wide enough, atmosphere scrubbers that kicked into active mode on detecting biological signatures, lighting that adjusted to wavelengths comfortable for human eyes. Adaptation protocols. The Velkareth, or whoever had built this, had planned for whoever came. At the center of the structure they found the room. It was large, proportioned for the beings who had built it, which made it vast for a human. The walls were covered in what Sohal immediately identified as an analog to the Kareth memory coral, but older, denser, emitting light in spectra that went beyond visible range in both directions. The Xenolinguists spent 40 minutes just identifying how many distinct data layers it contained. They stopped counting at 60. And in the center of the room, waiting as everything in this chain had been waiting, was a console. Simple. A single interface designed, Dresh was certain of this, to be operated by whatever species arrived regardless of physiology. It responded to touch, to biological presence, to intent in ways the ship's physicist would spend 2 years theoretically unsuccessfully accounting for. When Dresh placed her hand on it, it responded with a single line of text translated in real time through a system that clearly had linguistic data for every species in the chain including humanity, because of course it did, because the document had said the Velmara was a complete record of what humanity was, and this structure had received that record long before the Velmara launched. The text said, "Welcome. You are the 43rd species to reach this point. The previous 42 are waiting. We have much to discuss." Dresh stared at it. Then she laughed. Not a polished, command-appropriate response. A genuine, surprised, overwhelmed laugh. The laugh of someone who has spent 6 months carrying the weight of the largest discovery in human history and has just discovered that it is, in the architecture of what exists, not even particularly unusual. 43 species. 42 predecessors. A chain of civilizations, each shaped by the one before it, each carrying their inheritors through fire and grief and confusion toward a room at the edge of everything where something very old and very patient had been building something very large. She thought of the Queen, smiling on the floor of her chamber. She thought of the message, "We chose you because you were worth choosing." She thought of 42 other species who had stood exactly where she was standing, read exactly this line, and had the same realization, that the universe was not empty and not hostile and not indifferent, but was instead populated by the long, difficult, costly work of civilizations choosing to give the next ones a chance. She straightened. She pressed her hand more firmly against the console. "Tell them," she said, "that we're ready to talk." The console's response was immediate. Lights came on throughout the structure, not the slow sequential awakening of before, but a warm, full illumination that reached every corridor simultaneously. From deep within the superstructure, through the hull of her suit, Dresh felt something she couldn't define. A vibration, subsonic, that her nervous system processed less as sound and more as presence. Somewhere in the structure, doors were opening. The archivist, who had come with her and was standing 6 feet to her left, made a sound. The translation unit rendered it simply in the flat tone it always used. "They are coming to meet you." Dresh nodded. She looked at her hands. Steady. She was surprised to find them steady. She thought of the last line of the Queen's message, the one she had read alone in the dark in her quarters all those months ago. "What you do with what you've learned is yours." Yes, she thought. It is. She turned to face the doors. Thank you for watching this story. Kindly share your feedback in the comments. Your opinion matters. Also, let me know where you're watching from Globe Showing Europe Africa. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content. Constructive feedback is always welcome. If you have suggestions for improvement or better story ideas, feel free to share. Your support helps this channel grow. Thank you.